Welcome to the debate. Today, we're diving deep into the economic ripple effects of the U.S. tariffs on Indian goods. These officially went into effect back on August 27th, 2025. And this isn't just, about trade numbers. It's really about India's economic future, its trajectory. Our central question today is this: are these tariffs primarily a critical threat, a major danger to India's projected economic growth and stability, or do they maybe counterintuitively serve as a potent catalyst, a push for India to accelerate its economic diversification and much-needed domestic reforms? My position, essentially, is that while these tariffs are certainly challenging, they present a unique, maybe difficult, but unique opportunity for India to fundamentally recalibrate its economic strategy and ultimately strengthen its long-term resilience.
And I come at it from a slightly different angle. While yes, the long-term outlook might eventually push for some kind of recalibration, my contention is that these tariffs pose an immediate and frankly a profound threat to India's economy right now. The sheer scale of this impact, I think, necessitates urgent protective measures. We can't just talk about aspirational strategic shifts down the line. We need action now to cushion the blow on our most vulnerable sectors and, crucially, to safeguard our projected growth. We just can't afford to minimize the very real pain that's already being felt on the ground.
Okay, look, the imposition of these substantial U.S. tariffs, and we're talking a hefty 50% in total, it certainly casts a long shadow over our economic landscape. This includes, as you know, a 25% secondary tariff, basically an additional layer of duty, plus an extra 25% penalty that's directly linked to India's continued import of Russian crude oil. So this isn't some minor adjustment. It affects, approximately 55% of India's $87 billion in exports to the U.S. And yeah, it particularly hits sectors like textiles, carpets, and critical auto parts. However, in my analysis, this development, rather than being some insurmountable obstacle, it's actually a powerful strategic inflection point. We really must recognize India's inherent economic resilience. I mean, we saw this strength in action, didn't we? With that impressive 7.8% GDP growth in the first quarter of FY26, that's April to June 2025.
The really crucial buffer against external shocks like these tariffs. Furthermore, you've got India's services sector, which already accounts for a significant 47% of our total exports. And that's largely less affected by these specific goods tariffs, so that provides an additional critical cushion. In fact, this situation, it could even open unexpected doors. Consider our 44% share of U.S. smartphone imports. If global supply chains are forced to shift, perhaps favorably towards India, this could translate to a massive $50 billion in new exports. More broadly, look, these tariffs compel us. They force us to reduce our over-reliance on a single major market. They push us towards stronger, more diverse trade ties with regions like, say, Europe, Africa, or Southeast Asia. And crucially, I believe this is also the impetus needed to finally accelerate those much-needed structural reforms. Proposed policy measures like a comprehensive overhaul of the goods and services tax, the GST, while that could dramatically improve cost efficiency and business competitiveness, potentially adding another 0.2 to 0.3% toward GDP growth. So this isn't just a reaction, in my view. It's a powerful and timely push for systemic improvements that will benefit India for decades to come.
See, I just don't buy the premise that these tariffs are primarily an opportunity, particularly, as I said, in the short to medium term. While I absolutely acknowledge India's underlying resilience, nobody's denying that. The immediate economic reality is, well, it's stark. The chief economic advisor, V. Anantha Nageswaran, himself stated that this tariff regime could slash India's gross domestic product growth by approximately 0.5% to 0.6% in FY26. That's his own assessment. Other economists I've seen estimate the GDP hit could range even higher, maybe from 0.3% up to a really punishing 0.9%. I mean, that translates into billions and billions of dollars in lost economic activity. This impact, let's be very clear, isn't hypothetical. It's expected to be most pronounced in the second and third quarters of FY26, so it's hitting us hard and it's hitting us fast. These tariffs are, frankly, a direct body blow to India's export-driven sectors, particularly the small and medium-sized enterprises, our MSMEs, which, as we know, form the bedrock of local economies and employment across the country. Just imagine for a second a carpet weaver in Uttar Pradesh or maybe a steel manufacturer in Punjab suddenly finding their products priced out of the U.S. market overnight because of a 50% price hike. States like Tamil Nadu, Gujarat, Maharashtra, Karnataka, where these MSMEs are the backbone of industries like textiles, gems and jewelry, auto components, they're going to feel immense pain. We're talking job losses, business failures. Moody's ratings, for instance, they project a 0.3% GDP reduction for India. And they specifically warn that this tariff gap with other Asia-Pacific nations like Japan facing maybe 15% tariffs, or Vietnam and Bangladesh at 20%, well, that gap could severely hinder India's ambitious manufacturing goals, especially in the highly competitive electronics sector. And beyond the exporters, you've got the Indian rupee already under pressure, trading around 87.95 to the dollar. It could weaken further. And what does that mean? It means imports become more expensive for India's massive 400 million strong middle class. That squeezes household budgets, it dampens consumer sentiment, and ultimately it slows down overall economic activity. So, from my perspective, this isn't some abstract strategic reevaluation. It's a severe, immediate threat that demands urgent protective mitigation.
The severity of immediate economic impact versus long-term strategic opportunity.
Right. So my primary concern, and I really can't emphasize this enough, is the immediate and tangible economic hit we're facing right now. We're talking about a projected 0.5% to 0.6% reduction in GDP growth just for FY26. Now, this isn't some, theoretical figure on a spreadsheet. It has direct, cascading impacts on thousands of MSMEs across states like Tamil Nadu and Gujarat, as I mentioned. These are small businesses, often operating on razor-thin margins. They simply lack the financial cushion to absorb a 50% tariff hit. And maybe more critically, they just don't have the flexibility or the global networks to pivot to entirely new international markets overnight. It's just not feasible for many of them. So our immediate focus, I strongly believe, must be on preventing widespread business failures, safeguarding jobs, and offering immediate relief now. I mean, do we truly have the luxury of sitting back and waiting for long-term strategic shifts to maybe pan out when so many livelihoods are hanging in the balance today?
Okay, I see why you'd focus on the immediate challenge, and I absolutely agree the short-term difficulty is real for many businesses and workers. However, I think your emphasis, perhaps, overlooks the robustness of India's domestic demand. As I pointed out, that 7.8% GDP growth in Q1 FY26, that provides a substantial and I think often underestimated buffer. This underlying strength, this internal engine, is what allows us, I believe, to view these tariffs not as some existential crisis that demands only defensive reactions, but rather as a critical impetus for deeper structural change. And let's not forget the services sector, contributing nearly half of our total exports and largely unaffected by these specific goods tariffs. That further fortifies this position. It gives India the economic space, the breathing room to think strategically, to make bold moves for the long term, rather than simply reacting defensively to every single external pressure that comes along.
It's a fundamental difference in how we interpret India's current economic footing, I suppose.
But let's be realistic about that buffer, though. While domestic demand is indeed strong, it cannot fully offset the blow to our export-driven sectors, especially those that were heavily reliant on the U.S. market, which is a significant chunk, as we established. Furthermore, it certainly can't just negate the inflationary pressures that a weakening rupee, and it is weakening, hovering around 87.95 to the dollar, will inevitably place on the middle class. We're talking about approximately $66 billion of India's exports now suddenly vulnerable. That's a huge number. The projected GDP growth, 6.3% to 6.8% for FY26, which, frankly, many consider optimistic even before this hit, is already under significant threat. So how exactly does increased domestic demand help, say, a textile manufacturer in Tirunelveli who can no longer sell their garments in their primary market? Or how does it help a regular consumer who's now facing higher prices for essential imported goods because the rupee is weaker?
The immediate pain to these specific industries and the subsequent ripple effect on employment, that has to be paramount.
Well, my concern with that line of reasoning is that it seems to prioritize perhaps short-term symptom management over long-term systemic health. This situation, in my view, actually compels India. It forces our hand to accelerate policy actions that are beneficial in the long run, regardless of these specific tariffs. Take the proposed GST overhaul, for instance. This is a major reform, one that could add, estimates suggest, 0.2% to 0.3% to GDP. It becomes not just desirable, but urgent now. This isn't merely crisis management, it's actually an acceleration of structural improvements that will make India's economy inherently more competitive, more efficient, and more resilient. It protects us far beyond this specific tariff situation. You see, the tariffs expose a vulnerability we probably already knew existed deep down, and now they demand we address it decisively. We can't just keep patching holes, we have to use this moment to rebuild stronger.
Diversification of markets, necessity or strategic choice?
Okay, so moving to diversification, these tariffs, as difficult as they might feel right now, they effectively force India to actively diversify its export markets beyond just the US. This is, in my view, not just a necessary reaction spurred by pain, but actually a prudent long-term strategic choice that was perhaps moving a bit too slowly before this shock. It fundamentally reduces our over-reliance on any single market, which, let's face it, is always a vulnerability in itself. Strengthening existing trade agreements, forging new ones with major economic blocs like the European Union or the ASEAN countries, this presents tangible, real new avenues for our textiles, our electronics, other manufactured goods. This isn't just about weathering a storm. It's about strategically redirecting our trade currents, turning an immediate challenge into a profound opportunity for market expansion and deeper global integration over time.
That's a compelling argument on paper, absolutely. Diversification is a good goal. But have you really considered the immediate operational realities for the businesses involved? Diversification is certainly a laudable goal, but it is absolutely not an overnight solution. It takes time, investment, building relationships, especially for the MSMEs we keep talking about. These small businesses, particularly those operating in traditional sectors with very established supply chains, they often lack the financial resources, the market intelligence, the complex logistical networks required to swiftly pivot to entirely new international markets. They can't just decide tomorrow, okay, we're selling to Germany now instead of Ohio. It doesn't work like that. The immediate reality, the danger right now, is the substantial risk of losing that established U.S. market share to competitors, Vietnam, Bangladesh, maybe even China. And what happens then? These countries could potentially flood other Asian markets with their excess goods, severely undercutting Indian industries that are already struggling under this new tariff burden. So this isn't some gentle nudge towards a strategic choice. It feels more like a forced, potentially destabilizing shift that could leave many of our smaller, vital players in an extremely precarious position.
I appreciate the concern for the immediate impact. I really do. But we must also look at the proactive, strategic investments India's already outlining. The policy direction, opening up critical sectors like defense manufacturing, rural infrastructure development, road transport, opening these up to 100% foreign direct investment, FDI, that has the potential to create millions of jobs. I mean, just look at our $81 billion defense market alone. Estimates suggest it could generate maybe 1.2 million jobs by 2030 if we play our cards right. These are not just aspirational targets floating in the air. These are concrete pathways to new opportunities, not only for exports, but for really robust domestic growth and employment. These actions, these policy signals show a proactive, rather than a purely reactive approach to the shifting global trade dynamics. It's about building a more resilient and self-sufficient economy from within, one that is inherently less vulnerable to external tariff shocks down the road.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the long-term potential of FDI or, abstract job creation figures years from now somehow offsets the immediate crisis facing our existing export industries today. While those are absolutely vital structural changes for India's future, I agree with you there, the immediate need is far more acute, far more pressing. We need to engage in smart, aggressive trade talks with the U.S. right now. The goal has to be to reduce these crippling tariffs, perhaps the best-case scenario aiming for a more manageable 15–20% level. And alongside that, we need to provide immediate, targeted support for the MSMEs. That can mean low-interest loans, export subsidies, maybe even direct financial aid, just to help them survive this initial shock. Waiting for FDI to mature or for global supply chains to magically, organically shift in our favor, well, that is simply not a viable option for businesses that are facing collapse right now. Their future, their employees' futures, they can't wait for a decade-long plan to materialize.
The role of government policy and response.
So, following on from that, my perspective is that the government's immediate priority, its #1 job right now, must be robust, targeted support for these vulnerable MSMEs, coupled with relentless strategic negotiations with the U.S. We really need to acknowledge the severe asymmetry here. India's average import tariffs on U.S. goods are, around 11.6%? Meanwhile, the effective tariff on Indian exports heading the other way is now a staggering 20.6%, and that's before you even add the 25% Russian oil penalty. This huge imbalance demands a strong, assertive diplomatic push. India simply cannot afford to delay protective measures, just hoping that these long-term strategies will somehow materialize out of thin air and absorb the blow. We need concrete action today to defend our industries and maintain our economic stability.
I see why you emphasize that urgent diplomatic push. And yes, of course, negotiations are crucial. No one's denying that. However, I believe India's response should also focus, perhaps even more so, on fundamentally empowering itself internally, making us a more formidable player on the global stage, less susceptible to these kinds of pressures. How? By boosting domestic consumption through measures like, say, cutting income taxes for those earning above 15 lakh rupees, or maybe expanding crucial cash transfer programs like the PM Garib Kalyan Anna Yojana. These actions can unlock billions in domestic consumption. This directly helps offset export losses by stimulating internal demand. This internal strengthening, combined with significant ongoing infrastructure investment, fundamentally makes India a more resilient and, frankly, a more formidable negotiating partner. One that is less vulnerable to future external pressures and can therefore negotiate from a position of strength, not desperation.
That's an interesting point. And boosting domestic consumption is absolutely vital for the long term. I agree. But I would frame its immediate effectiveness differently in this specific context. The very economic pressure from these tariffs, driving potential inflation through a weakening rupee, causing actual job losses in export sectors, could ironically reduce the purchasing power for the middle class in the near term. This could actually make some of these domestic stimulus measures less effective right now, as consumers grapple with tighter budgets and economic uncertainty. So the focus, therefore, must remain squarely on addressing the external challenge head-on, the tariffs, and protecting the specific sectors and livelihoods that are directly impacted by these very real export losses, rather than just hoping internal measures can somehow entirely compensate for such a direct external hit.
I'm still not entirely convinced by that line of reasoning because my analysis of the situation, looking at the broader context, suggests this isn't merely an external challenge to be mitigated or deflected. This is fundamentally a wake-up call for India, a loud one. It's one that unequivocally demands agility, innovation, and yes, bold policy moves. The path ahead, as I see it, requires precisely that deep agility in our responses, profound innovation in our industries, and truly bold policy decisions from our leaders. India's ability to actually turn this challenge into an opportunity, as the saying goes, relies not just on applying short-term remedies or band-aids, but on fundamentally embracing these deeper, systemic reforms. It's about building a more self-reliant, a more globally diversified, and ultimately a more resilient economic future for ourselves, making us inherently less vulnerable to such shocks in the first place. That, to me, is the real policy imperative here. Conclusion. So, in sum, while the U.S. tariffs undeniably present a significant and immediate challenge, my perspective remains that they profoundly underscore India's intrinsic economic resilience. And perhaps more importantly, they provide a critical and frankly urgent impetus to accelerate the strategic diversification of our markets and to implement those profound internal economic reforms that, let's be honest, we're probably overdue anyway. India's strong domestic fundamentals, combined with the proactive policy measures now being explored and debated, offer, I believe, a robust foundation to not merely weather the storm, but to actually emerge stronger, more innovative, and ultimately far less dependent on any single market on the global stage. This is a moment of challenge, yes, absolutely, but it's also potentially a crucible for forging our future economic strength.
And to summarize my position, the immediate and substantial economic threat posed by these tariffs, particularly to our key export sectors and our numerous vulnerable MSMEs, simply cannot be overstated or wished away. While considering long-term strategies and diversification is of course valuable for any nation, the urgent priority right now must be to implement targeted mitigation measures, support for businesses, support for workers, and to engage in robust, assertive, diplomatic efforts to cushion the blow now. This is absolutely critical for protecting India's projected economic growth in the near term, and, perhaps even more importantly, for safeguarding the livelihoods of millions of people across our nation who are facing immediate economic uncertainty because of these actions. The risk of inaction or of waiting too long for long-term plans to bear fruit is simply too great, in my view.
Well, it is certainly clear that the situation facing India is complex. There are compelling arguments on both sides regarding this tension between the immediate threat and the potential long-term opportunity. The path forward undoubtedly demands a delicate balance of defensive measures and proactive strategic shifts.
Absolutely. And there is certainly much more to explore regarding the precise execution and, indeed, the ultimate outcomes of these varied strategies as India continues to navigate this very challenging economic landscape.